Hey everybody, today we're going to be connecting ShuttleOps to Kubernetes cluster. This is going to allow us to create deploy pipelines with Kubernetes as the destination. In order to get started, we do need a Kubernetes cluster with administrative access to it. And if you don't already have one, then you could use AWS's Elastic Kubernetes Service, GCP's Google Kubernetes Engine, Azure's Azure Kubernetes Service, and launch one. But I am going to use, for this particular example, an already running EKS cluster. So to start, we navigate to the Connect tab, and we find the Kubernetes card. We hit Connect, and we're prompted for a set of values. The first two values here are just arbitrary names. So this is specifically the name for our credential. So I'm just going to call this the tutorial cluster credential. And the cluster name is just an arbitrary name to help me organize this credential and understand which cluster it corresponds to. So I'm just going to say this is the tutorial cluster, but the rest of these values need to be retrieved from the Kubernetes API for our cluster. And so here's how you retrieve them. From a shell with kubectl installed and a kubeconfig present for our cluster, we're going to be applying the Kubernetes manifest provided by the ShuttleOps documentation. The manifest contains resources that will create the service account and the role that ShuttleOps is going to be using when deploying resources to Kubernetes. So we simply have to do a Kubernetes apply on the manifest, and we can see that the resources are created. Now we're going to be retrieving the values of the token for the service account, and also the certificate authority and the version of the Kubernetes cluster. But first, we are going to retrieve the token. So we type in the commands provided by the ShuttleOps documentation. So here is the token. This is going to be the value that we're going to be copying and pasting into the input on the ShuttleOps Connect page. But we also need the certificate authority. So we could use kubectl config view, and this will give us our certificate authority certificate right here. And it's also going to give us our API endpoint. Lastly, we just need the version of the Kubernetes API for our cluster, and we can see here, server version, that we're on 1.17. So now we can return to ShuttleOps and input these values. Once we've inputted all of the values that we retrieved from Kubernetes, we're able to save our connection. And now we can navigate to the Deploy tab and begin creating our deploy pipeline. Here we're going to select Container Registry as our source because it's compatible with the Kubernetes destination. We're going to select the Kubernetes destination, and we're going to create a basic pipeline. I'm going to name this Grafana because I'm going to be deploying Grafana as our example service. So now we are able to select our component, which is going to be the Docker image on Docker Hub with the name Grafana/Grafana. And we're going to be using the latest tag for this container. So now we've added our component, and we're going to configure our Kubernetes destination. So in order to create the Kubernetes deployment and service for Grafana, we're going to click on Add New Pod Template. And we can see that Grafana is already selected. But now we're going to have to add a service of type load balancer in order for our service to be reachable from outside of the cluster. So here, we're going to name this service HTTP. We're going to be using port 80. So that means when we hit the load balancer provisioned by our EKS cluster on port 80, we're going to be able to hit this service. And the port that we're going to be targeting is port 3000 because that is the port that Grafana listens on by default. So once all this is configured, we can hit save. And we are now able to launch our pipeline. So we hit launch, and we can see that our pipeline has already been successful. If you go to logs, we can see that our Grafana deployment and the service have already been provisioned by ShuttleOps. And in order for us to be able to take a look at that service, we go to the Manage page, click on the Clusters tab, click the cluster that we just configured. So in this case, tutorial cluster. We will now click the default namespace because that's where we provisioned to. And we can see that our service is active with this external endpoint, and our deployment is active as well. Now, even though ShuttleOps created the Grafana service and the Grafana deployment right away, what happens behind the scenes is when you deploy a service of type load balancer, the cloud controller manager component in the Kubernetes control plane is going to actually communicate with the AWS API and provision an AWS ELB to make that service publicly accessible. And this is the external endpoint for that ELB. Now, it may need to, well, it will need to pass health checks before it is actually able to serve traffic. And this may be further delayed by how long it takes for the cloud control manager to actually provision this ELB. So just be aware that you may need to wait a couple minutes before having your pipeline succeed and actually being able to hit your service. In our case, we were actually able to get this spun up fairly quickly, but just keep that in mind. So as you can see, Grafana has been deployed by ShuttleOps using a deploy pipeline. And I hope you found this useful. And hopefully this will allow you to create many, many deploy pipelines for Kubernetes as a destination in ShuttleOps.